Drafting the right players in a fantasy football draft, well, that's fun. But getting those guys at the right time, getting them when they are a terrific value, getting them when they are an absolute steal in your fantasy football drafts, that is how you dominate the competition before that first football is even kicked in week 1. But what does a good fantasy football draft look like in 2024? Let's do one together right here, right now, in episode 29 of Inside the 20 by Basement Brewed Fantasy Football. What's up, my friend? It is Babyface Mikey coming at you, more recently known as Mustache Mikey, soon to be known as his regular beard is back. Mikey, that is a terrible nickname. I can do better than that. Today we are going to go through a mock draft together from the 3 spot in a 12-team PPR draft on Sleeper. Now, the one thing I want you to know before we dive in is that I'm not just some guy in his basement doing a mock draft for you to watch. I mean, I definitely am. I'm just some guy in his basement doing a mock draft for you to watch. But I'm also coming into this having done over 250 plus real drafts already this summer. And when I say real drafts, I'm not talking about mock drafts against a computer, which is what we're about to do here today together. I'm talking about very real drafts over on drafters.com, best ball drafts. Really quickly, if you're wondering why drafters.com is my best ball platform of choice, there's really 3 main reasons. Number 1, the ADP is really friendly. The ADP is really soft. There's money to be won. There's prizes and tournaments to be won. Number 2, you can do a fast draft, which is 30 seconds per pick, or you can just rack up a whole bunch of slow drafts all at once, because slow drafts allow up to 8 hours per pick. I literally have over 40 drafts going right now as we speak. And number 3, you can join contests for as low as $1.10. Easy platform to play on. You can play on desktop or PC. You can play on the mobile app. And if you're the type of person who enjoys doing a mock draft to get ready for 2024 fantasy football season, I highly recommend instead doing best ball drafts, because they're just like mock drafts, but with a little bit of skin in the game, a little bit more fun. If you want to give Drafters a try, I left a link for you down below in the show notes, and if you enter promo code BBFF when you're making your first deposit, Drafters is going to 100% match your first deposit up to $100. It's like you have a free $100 to play fantasy football with. Use promo code BBFF when making that first deposit. With skin in the game, with money on the line, against other human beings, against other fantasy football players. I've already done 250 plus of these. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see at the top where I'm scrolling, this is how many drafts I currently have going all at once. I mean, this is way too many, probably 50 drafts or so. But the thing that I love about drafters.com is that they offer slow drafts up to 8 hours per pick. You'll see that in this example, I'm on the clock in one of these slow drafts, but I still have 7 hours and 40 minutes, so I'll wait to make that pick until the end of this episode. I have done over 200 of those drafts, maybe 250, and counting. By the time the summer's over, I'll have done probably close to 500 of those best ball drafts, and because of that, I have a built-in inherent knowledge in my head of where players tend to land in fantasy football drafts, meaning I know what rounds I can be eyeballing some steals, meaning I can make picks 1, 2, and 3, having a pretty good knowledge of who's going to be available to me with my 7th pick, my 8th pick, my 9th pick. It very much plays into my advantage when I'm doing fantasy football drafts on drafters, but also in my home leagues and in other maybe more higher profile leagues that I'm a part of as well. And it's an advantage that I make available to my 300 plus subscribers over at Basement Brewed Fantasy Football in the form of my 2024 fantasy football draft guide. So this is something that all of my subscribers have access to over at basementbrewedff.com. There's a link for you to check it out in the show notes if you're interested. But every single one of my subscribers has access to this guide that I have built and maintained off of 200 plus real drafts and 30 plus hours of weekly research that I'm doing literally every single week. It comes with tiers for planning ahead, rankings for difficult decisions, deep 2024 previews telling you what to expect from every single player. There's over 250 of these previews, and there's a whole lot more to this draft guide that we're going to use throughout today's episode. But the whole point is, as we're going through this, I'm going to try and explain what's happening in my brain as I'm making these draft picks, so that as you're preparing for your 2024 fantasy football drafts, you have some knowledge to walk into that draft with in terms of what to expect and how to approach the 2024 fantasy football landscape. Are you a software wizard? A code ninja? A forge master? Or maybe even just a mad scientist? Then come build your career ladder with Infinity Labs, an award-winning technology company, best place to work, and business of the year with best-in-class benefits and compensation. Visit i-labs.tech. That's i-labs.tech today, where you can learn more about Infinity Labs, our expanding national presence, and why the status quo has no hold on us. All right, so I set this thing up to reflect a pretty standard fantasy football league these days. We're approaching this as if we're starting 1 quarterback, 2 running backs, 3 wide receivers, 1 tight end, 1 flex, 1 kicker, and 1 defense, which most of my leagues don't even have kickers and defenses anymore, but I know most leagues do still have those. So we'll talk about how to approach the kicker position, the defense position, quarterback, tight end. We're going to go 15 rounds right here, which is a pretty shallow bench, meaning at most we're going to have 1 quarterback, 1 tight end, 1 kicker, 1 defense, and then the remaining 11 players are going to be all running backs and all wide receivers. In fact, that's not enough, but that's where we're at. So we're drafting from the number 3 spot in today's mock draft. Now, not especially surprising, Christian McCaffrey and CeeDee Lamb, in this case, are the first 2 players off the board. Usually it's flipped. Usually it's Christian McCaffrey and then CeeDee Lamb. But I can tell you with 100% certainty, I will be going wide receiver here with my first pick. In fact, when you pull up the 2024 draft guide from Basement Brewed Fantasy Football, we are draft spot 3, so I'll change that real quick, and you're going to see over here upcoming picks changes based on where our draft spot is. So there it goes. So our next pick we know is going to be pick 20, then 25, 44, 49, 68. That helps us a lot when we're evaluating ADP and where to expect players to be drafted in the upcoming rounds. So next pick, this is pick 3 overall, and we know our next pick after this is going to be 22, but I will adjust that when the time is right. Christian McCaffrey and CeeDee Lamb are off the board. We're just going to go ahead and delete them right out of there, and you'll see that there's 2 players remaining in tier number 1 of Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide, and that's Tyreek Hill and Jamar Chase. Now, if you're not familiar with the concept of tiering players, I just deleted CMC and CeeDee Lamb. Both of those guys are also in tier 1. The idea with a tier is that all of those players are valued relatively similarly heading into the season, meaning, technically speaking, because Jamar Chase is he's 4th overall in my rankings, but he's in tier 1, I would be okay. I wouldn't argue with somebody taking Jamar Chase with the number 1 overall pick because he's in that first tier with Christian McCaffrey. But here we are. We know that we want to stay in tier 1. We want to keep it pretty simple. Not really a whole heck of a lot to discuss here. We want to go either with Tyreek Hill or Jamar Chase. I'm going to go with Tyreek Hill because he is ranked higher. And frankly, I actually have less exposure to Tyreek Hill than I do Jamar Chase in 2024 fantasy football. So I'm going to draft him, cross him off the list, and we're going to update this to reflect pick 22. And let's hop back over to Sleeper and actually make the selection. So here we are with our second round pick, the 10th pick in the second round. This is pick number 22 overall. Now, I've updated the 2024 Fantasy Football Draft Guide. I've deleted all of the following picks. If you're listening on podcasts and you're not able to see this on YouTube, after I picked Tyreek Hill, it went Amon-Ra St. Brown, Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Bijan Robinson, Breece Hall, A.J. Brown, Puka Nacua, Garrett Wilson, and Jonathan Taylor to round out the first round. And then the second round went Devontae Adams, Jahmyr Gibbs, Marvin Harrison, Drake London, Kyron Williams, Sam Laporta, Saquon Barkley, Devon Achane, and Chris Olave. And here we are in the second round. We are on the clock. And this is going to be a perfect example of where tiers and tiering players in a fantasy football draft is so much more important, so much more smart, for lack of a better term, than just following a blind list of rankings. You don't just want to go top to bottom in a list of rankings. You want to be able to build your team in a way that's constructive for the rest of your roster. Meaning, right now, you're looking at Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide, and you'll see that the best available player in my rankings is Deebo Samuel. So if I was just following top to bottom, or even if I was going off my own cheat sheet, which you'll see here, a printable cheat sheet, which is the same thing, it's just a printable version of the draft guide. But if I was just going top to bottom from from the best available player, I would be taking Deebo Samuel. I'd be taking my second wide receiver here. However, take a look at the next tier. Tier 6, which is conveniently shaded in yellow. It makes it easy for you to identify that next tier. Every single one of the players in this tier, except for one, is a wide receiver. And I also know, just based on doing 200 plus drafts, 250 drafts, that the next several rounds are about to get quite wide receiver heavy, meaning there's going to be a massive pool of wide receivers to choose from in rounds 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. And if you've been following along, if you've been following the podcasts, you've been reading my blogs, you've been reading my newsletters, you've been following on social media, you know I love Derrick Henry in 2024 fantasy football, possibly more than any other fantasy football analyst or anybody who plays fantasy football. So this is a perfect spot for us to go ahead and take Derrick Henry, even though he's at the quote-unquote bottom of this tier. He's the 4th best ranked player in this tier. He's still in the same tier as Deebo, as Cooper Kupp, as Jalen Waddle, and I am going to be loaded with wide receivers in the next couple picks. This is a perfect spot to take my first running back in Derrick Henry. Now, I will point out, I will make note of this. If you'll see on the screen, you'll see over here the green, red, and yellow stoplights. These are meant to suggest the right time to take a player, which is colored in green, labeled draft, reach for a player, which is colored in yellow, labeled reach, or wait on a player because you might be able to get them in the next round. Might be able to get them in the next round is why Derrick Henry is shaded red, and it's recommended that we wait, because if you'll see here, Derrick Henry's average draft position is pick 30, and we're about to have another pick around pick 30 coming up in the next coming up in the 3rd round. But you'll also see, if you go over to the ADP over time, these beautiful red lines, this is meant to show you which direction a player is trending in real drafts. This is something I update every week, and if you'll see here next to Derrick Henry's name, that trend line is starting to trend up big time, and I can confirm this after doing 200 plus real drafts. I used to get Derrick Henry in the early 4th round of fantasy football drafts, and now we're seeing him go in the early 3rd round of fantasy football drafts. So, to recap, this is a perfectly fine place for you to take a Deebo Samuel, a Cooper Kupp, a Jalen Waddle. I also think it's possible I find one of those guys in the 3rd round, but we'll find out. This is a perfect time for us to grab RB. Don't miss out on our first running back. Let's go ahead and grab Derrick Henry, cross him off the list, and make the selection. You want to see something absolutely gorgeous? Here we are in round 3, and in round 2, we were able to get the last remaining running back in Tier 5 of Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide. Now, after I made that pick, after I picked Derrick Henry, it went Brandon Ayuk, Travis Kelce, Josh Jacobs, Josh Allen, and we are back on the clock, and Deebo Samuel, Cooper Kupp, and Jalen Waddle are all available. So not only were we able to get the last remaining running back in the best available tier, but now we still have our choice of Deebo Samuel, Cooper Kupp, Jalen Waddle, the 3 best receivers left in the best available tier. And one thing I forgot to point out, one thing I forgot to mention when we were in round 2 of this draft. Now, Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide, it offers ADP and it's meant to help give you an idea of where players are going to be drafted. But you should always, always, always keep your league, your settings, the place that you play, whether it's ESPN or Yahoo or Sleeper that you see here. Those sites have their own ADP, and that can influence your competitors. That can influence where your competition drafts the players that they pick. And one thing I forgot to mention in round 2 when I was looking at Derrick Henry was that Derrick Henry had a chance to coming back to me in round 3, but guys like Deebo Samuel, who if you can see on the screen is still pretty far down this list, Cooper Kupp is even further down, Jalen Waddle, Derrick Henry was more likely, according to Sleeper's ADP, to be drafted higher than Deebo Samuel and Cooper Kupp and Jalen Waddle, which made it even easier for me to decide, hey, let's pull the trigger, let's grab Derrick Henry now, and we'll just grab whatever wide receiver is going to be available to us in the next round. Again, it's a perfect example of why tiering your players is more important than ranking your players. And here's another reason why ranking your players is more important. I'm not going to be taking Jalen Waddle here. I'm going to be taking either Deebo Samuel or Cooper Kupp. Now, I'll be honest with you. If you ask me hour to hour, minute to minute, second to second, I'm going to flip-flop on Deebo Samuel and Cooper Kupp all day, every day. In fact, quick little secret for you. Fantasy football analysts hate ranking players. We hate it. We hate splitting hairs between two guys that are basically the same. That's why tiers are so much more important. You really can't go wrong. Deebo Samuel and Cooper Kupp, same guy. Staring at this right now, my rankings say Deebo Samuel. Deebo Samuel's at the top of this list, but I'm going Cooper Kupp because that's just the way the motion is moving me at this moment here. So with pick 27 overall, we are going to find Cooper Kupp, unless, of course, he's way down. Yeah, Cooper Kupp, especially in a PPR league, which is what we're drafting for. And we're starting this draft going Tyreek Hill, Derrick Henry, Cooper Kupp. Here we are. We are back on the clock in the 4th round of this 15-round mock fantasy football draft. This is pick 46 overall. Okay, we've started this thing with Tyreek Hill and Cooper Kupp as our wide receivers. Derrick Henry's holding it down as our RB1. Now, this is where it gets really, really fun for people like me who have done 200, 250 plus real drafts with skin in the game against very real fantasy football players. I'm going to let you in on a little secret here. List of quote-unquote rankings that are actually pretty decent, better than any of the other free rankings you'll find out there. I'll just leave it at that. Go ahead and simply download the rankings or the ADP. Download that spreadsheet from drafters.com. And here's why. People like me, 200, 250 plus drafts, we're degenerates. We're kind of psycho. We've done 250 drafts and it's not even August yet. But you know who tends to be pretty good at fantasy football? Are those players, are those people that are doing all these drafts. And what I'm getting at here is if you have real fantasy football players playing on drafters.com or Underdog or DraftKings, wherever they're playing, the average draft position, the ADP for those websites, tends to be a little bit sharp. It tends to be a bit strong. It tends to be a little bit competitive. When you go over to some of the free websites where a lot of more casual fantasy football players like to play, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that at all, but where a lot of casual fantasy football players are the Yahoos, the ESPNs, the CBS, the NFLs, the average draft position on those websites tend to be a bit, let's just call it soft, for lack of a better term. If you want to run through your own exercise, take the average draft position from a sharp website like an Underdog or a drafters.com and simply compare that to players and their average draft position over on Yahoo or ESPN. And I'll give you a really good example. We're going to scroll all the way down to our next batch of picks. Let's look at picks where players that might be available to me around picks in the 6th round and the 7th round. Sleeper is really cool. They give you this line here that shows you where your next pick is going to be, just to give you an idea of the players that might be available in that range. Now, one name that pops out at me automatically is Hollywood Brown. Marquise Brown, who just signed with Kansas City Chiefs. He's one of Patrick Mahomes' new targets. His average draft position on Sleeper is 77.5, nearly pick 78. Okay, so we're talking 6th round, 7th round. Over on Drafters, which is where a lot of sharp, obsessed fantasy football players have been doing drafts all summer, Marquise Hollywood Brown is currently right here. He's drafted around pick 50, 51. Okay? So on Sleeper, Hollywood Brown goes around 78. and on Drafters, he goes around 51. And no offense to Sleeper, but I'm going to trust Drafters' ranking, not even ADP, ranking of Marquise Brown more than I'm going to trust Sleeper's ranking of Marquise Brown, just based on the talent of the people that play over on drafters.com or on Underdog or on DraftKings. Okay, so we're talking about a 2-round difference on Marquise Brown, and that's just one example. So this is where fantasy football drafts get really, really, really fun for people like me, for Basement Brewed Fantasy Football subscribers, because we're able to take the BBFF draft guide, apply it to these soft ADPs and these soft rankings over on Sleeper and Yahoo and ESPN, and absolutely destroy a fantasy football draft. We're already making this next pick knowing that it's possible we'll get Marquise Brown in the 6th round if we even want him. But with this pick, 4th round, the best players available are wide receivers in the tier, right? You look at the best remaining tier, tier 7, and it's 4 wide receivers, and Christian Kirk, Amari Cooper, Zay Flowers, T. Higgins. We're on pick 46, and you'll see here, we're well past each of those guys' ADP on tough websites like Drafters. Okay, the value is there, right? We have Christian Kirk ranked at 35, and we're on pick 46. We got Cooper, Flowers, and Higgins ranked 36, 37, 38, and we're on pick 46. The time is perfect to get any one of these guys. Basically, take your pick. I'm going to just go ahead. If you watched, I don't remember what episode it was, but I did an episode on the Cincinnati Bengals and who we want to smash or pass in that. T. Higgins, I love T. Higgins this year. I did an episode on the Ravens. I don't love Zay Flowers this year. I like him at this cost. This cost for Zay Flowers is terrific. I haven't done the Browns yet, but I did do the Jaguars. And I love Christian Kirk this year. So we're just going to go right from the top. We're going to grab Christian Kirk. Now, one real quick thing I want to note before I actually make this pick, scrolling back to the top, we're coming up on that 4th, 5th round turn tends to be a very fruitful one for tight ends. A lot of times we see Trey McBride here, but you'll see he's already been drafted 2 picks ago. We usually get guys like Mark Andrews and Dalton Kincaid, both of which are more than capable of being fantasy football's #1 overall tight end in 2024 fantasy football. And even though they're in the next tier for me, those are guys that I might be considering with my next pick. The reason I will not take one of those tight ends right here, I won't take Mark Andrews and I won't take Dalton Kincaid, is because there's only 2 teams behind me after I make this pick. And the team in the #1 spot that started with CeeDee Lamb, his second pick was Travis Kelce, meaning it's more likely than not, a lot more likely than not, that he or she is happy with their tight end selection and they won't be taking a tight end. In other words, it's highly likely that Mark Andrews and or Dalton Kincaid is going to come back to me in the 5th round. I'd rather just take my favorite wide receiver here that's available, grab Christian Kirk, and keep this thing moving. Here we are in round 5, and as predicted, one of those stud tight ends, and Mark Andrews, did go off the board along with James Cook, Joe Mixon, and Alvin Kamara. That means I have an interesting decision to make here in round 5, pick 51 overall, because in the best remaining tier, tier 7 of Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide, you'll see we still have Amari Cooper, Zay Flowers, and T. Higgins. Candidly, getting any of those guys in round 5 is mouthwatering. And this is a heck of a decision because it's really hard mentally to pass on those guys. But oftentimes, one of the biggest traps that fantasy football players fall into is falling in love with specific players instead of roster construction. And when I say roster construction, that means making each draft pick with an understanding of whether or not it makes your overall team better, as opposed to just taking a player that you really, really like. So with this pick in the 5th round, man, I would love to have T. Higgins, Amari Cooper, or Zay Flowers. And I'd be fine with somebody making that pick. You can't go wrong. Like, if you're going to roll out T. Higgins in your flex every week, you've already won. Like, I won't argue anybody doing that. However, More, and one other thing I'll say here. I don't necessarily recommend going out of the top tier that you're in. I wouldn't necessarily recommend to somebody that they come out of tier 7 to go into tier 8 if tier 7 is the best remaining tier. They should try and stick in that tier. That said, just knowing what I know about how 2024 fantasy football drafts play out, knowing that guys like Marquise Brown, who is the, 7th ranked player remaining in my list right now, Terry McLaurin, who's the 4th ranked player remaining, guys like Christian Watson, guys like that could be available later, and knowing that some of these high-powered options could be available later in the drafts, whereas tight end starts to fall off a cliff. And Dalton Kincaid, by the way, is a very, very sneaky bet to finish as fantasy's number 1 tight end overall this year. The Buffalo Bills do not have Stephon Diggs anymore. They don't have Gabe Davis anymore. They did draft Keon Coleman. They did bring in Curtis Samuel, but there's no clear-cut number 1 option. Dalton Kincaid was very hot, very good down the stretch. It's very possible that Dalton Kincaid is Josh Allen's number 1 option. He is a very, very good bet to be fantasy football's number 1 overall tight end this year, and even if he's not, he should be a top 5 option at worst. This is a rare case where I'm going to avoid the players that are available in the top tier. I don't do this often. I don't usually tier hop, but this is a rare case where I am going to pass on Amari Cooper, Zay Flowers, T. Higgins, knowing that I could maybe get Terry McLaurin, Marquise Brown, those guys later, where I can't get a guy like Dalton Kincaid in the upcoming round. So Dalton Kincaid is going to be the selection here. And before I make this pick, I recognize that you might be cringing, you might be getting a little bit nervous that we're about to make pick number 5 and we have 1 running back. I recognize that is super uncomfortable. Candidly, this is not an uncommon build for me. This is pretty frequent for what I do in 2024. It's not intentional. I don't go into a draft saying, I'm only going to draft 1 running back in the first 5 rounds. It's just the way that it shakes out in 2024, and you're about to see why. You're about to see that in rounds 6, 7, 8, 9, tend to be loaded with some pretty solid RB2 options. So it makes it really easy in 2024 to stack up on high-powered wide receivers, a really strong number 1 tight end, get yourself a really strong number 1 running back, and then you can backfill the RB2 position pretty easily with a lot of good options that are going to come up in the 6th round, which you're going to see in just a minute. But for now, Dalton Kincaid it is. Well. Here we are, round 6. Which makes this pick, 70, as you'll see on the draft guide. And lo and behold, look at who's available in terms of wide receivers. We got both Terry McLaurin and Hollywood Brown. If you rewind 30 seconds, 45 seconds, you'll see Terry McLaurin was the 4th best available player when I made my pick way back in the 5th round when we initially selected Dalton Kincaid, meaning we were able to get a top 5 tight end. And now we have an opportunity to grab a wide receiver that usually goes in the late 4th round of competitive fantasy football websites like drafters.com. Now that said, we do have a decision to make here. We can take our RB2, and like I just mentioned in round 5 when we took Dalton Kincaid, there's a lot of really, really good options that are coming up and available on the board. We got Najee Harris as the top-ranked running back available in Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide. You give me a running back in an Arthur Smith offense that's finished top 10 in rushing attempts in 4 of the 5 seasons that he's been an offensive coordinator or an NFL head coach. In fact, Arthur Smith's offenses have finished top 3 in rushing attempts in 3 of the last 4 years. And now we have a chance to get a guy like Najee Harris, his RB1, in the 6th round. So that's an option for this pick. We also, knowing that we are getting tremendous value and an absolute steal on both Terry McLaurin and Marquise Brown. Again, these are guys that usually are drafted at the 4th and 5th round turn of drafters.com, which is a PPR league, which is what we're doing right now. So we can grab one of these guys and trust that they are going to be in our flex spot. That is a dang good flex to be rolling out there every single week. Or we can take our quarterback. Now, candidly, if this was me personally in my real draft, I'm a big believer in streaming quarterbacks, especially because of the late round options that are available. I mean, a lot of times these drafts, you can walk out of here with Tua Tagovailoa, Justin Herbert, Kirk Cousins, Deshaun Watson, Aaron Rodgers, Matthew Stafford. There's so many options that you can stream. I am a big believer in streaming, and that's largely because I use Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's heat map. Now, this is the tool that started this entire business after it exploded a little bit on Reddit several years back. This is something that I put out for my subscribers every single week. It's contextual matchup analysis for every single player in every single game, every single week, telling you basically what to expect from that player in the upcoming week. And when you need a streamer, when injuries inevitably strike and bye weeks start to come in and you just need a plug-and-play option, inside this heat map is a streamers tab that's going to offer you several quarterbacks, tight ends, kickers, and defenses that you can likely just grab right off your waiver wire and add into your starting lineup. So in this case, this was week 13 of last year. Russell Wilson was the best possible option that week. Derek Carr, Gardner Minshew. And if you want to read why, you simply come over back to the heat map, you search for Russell Wilson, click on his name, and you're going to get full contextual analysis from what to expect from that player. I do this for every single player in every single team, every single game, every single week, which is 250 plus players that I'm doing this for every week. Week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4. So if this was me in a real draft, in a regular draft, I probably would not be taking quarterback here. I'd keep hammering wide receivers and running backs and just stream quarterback. I can get Brock Purdy later. I can get Kirk Cousins later. I can get Tua Tagovailoa. There's so many options that I can use later. But recognizing that this is a mock draft and you probably don't feel comfortable going into week 1 without a quarterback, we do have some options here. We do have Joe Burrow still available on the board. We have Kyler Murray still available on the board. And we have Jordan Love available on the board, each of which I would feel comfortable with being my every week QB1. Now, we see, again, we're in a spot where there's only 4 picks after I make this selection. There's only 2 teams making draft picks after I make this pick. One of those teams already has Josh Allen. So we're pretty sure that the Josh Allen team most likely is not going to draft a second quarterback here, meaning the team that doesn't have a quarterback, they could take Kyler Murray, they can take Joe Burrow, they can take Jordan Love, and I can just take whichever one's left, whichever one's available in the 7th round. So we're going to skip quarterback with this pick, but we still have to make that decision between whether or not we want a wide receiver or we want a running back, and prepare to get super uncomfortable because we're going wide receiver here. We're going Terry McLaurin. We're going Marquise Brown. I'll grab Terry McLaurin with this pick. And yes, I know this is going to be uncomfortable because we just talked about taking quarterback in the round 7, meaning we're going to enter round 8 having 1 running back. And I know Christian McCaffrey, Saquon Barkley, Bijan Robinson, those guys win leagues. How can we go into round 8 with just 1 running back? Take a deep breath. Keep the faith. Running back is arguably, besides quarterback, the most replaceable position in fantasy football. Meaning, we know for a fact, let me just grab any running back. We know for a fact that if Kenneth Walker, for example, were to get injured, we know for a fact that regardless of whether or not you think Zach Charbonnet is any good, we know Zach Charbonnet is going to get a ton of volume. So I like to stock my fantasy football rosters full of wide receivers that would be really difficult to replace. If I lose Cooper Kupp, I'm not going to be able to grab somebody off of waivers that can replace that production. But if Kenneth Walker goes down, Zach Charbonnet should be able to fill in and at least get a decent percentage of what you would get from Kenneth Walker on a weekly basis. So what I want to do is stock up on those high-powered wide receivers and then stack my bench with just a ton of solid RB2, RB3 flex type of options that have upside if the guy in front of them goes down. And I'll tell you right now, my main target going into round 8 or with our 8th round pick is going to be a guy like Jaylen Warren, who's on the Pittsburgh Steelers, who's in that Arthur Smith offense, but he's well known to be a pass-catching weapon out of the backfield, a better pass-catching running back than Najee Harris, and we love that kind of upside in PPR. And then if anything does happen to Najee Harris, now you got Jaylen Warren potentially being the RB1 in an Arthur Smith offense. So we're going to grab Terry McLaurin, who's going to be our fourth wide receiver, and then on the way back, we're just going to get whatever quarterback is available to us. All right, so we are back on the clock in the 8th round, right? We took Terry McLaurin in the 6th. We chose whatever quarterback was left over, which was Kyler Murray. Joe Burrow went while we were waiting for the draft to come back to us. So we ended up with Kyler Murray as our QB1 in the 7th round. Hard to be upset about that. That's a great QB1 to bet on in fantasy football. So now we're back on the clock, right? And again, we have a decision to make, although it's really not going to be too much of a decision. Christian Watson is the best available player according to Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's rankings. He's alone in the best available tier. Quite frankly, he should have been drafted forever ago. The fact that he's still available is wild. This is a guy that is usually drafted around pick 66 on drafters, which is in the middle of the 6th round. So he should have been drafted somewhere around here over 2 rounds ago. But we got Tyreek Hill, we got Cooper Kupp, we got Christian Kirk, we got Terry McLaurin. And as I mentioned earlier in the episode, roster construction sometimes trumps best player available or players that you're obsessed with, players that you love. And if you listened to my Packers preview, Christian Watson has as much upside as anybody in fantasy football. It's really hard to skip him in this pick. But we do only have one running back. We got Derrick Henry. And as much as I like to stock up on wide receivers, at some point we do need to grab some running backs. I mentioned with the last pick that Jaylen Warren is the target, and you'll see he is available. He's still on the board. However, I was not expecting Zach Moss to still be available with this pick. And to be clear, I do like Jaylen Warren more than I like Zach Moss in a PPR league. If you listen to my I've actually done a couple episodes now on the Bengals, on Zach Moss. I think he's a little bit of a trap in fantasy football. However, he is drafted at a very appropriate cost in 2024 fantasy football leagues. We're talking 8th round, 9th round. That's a perfectly fine price to pay for a guy who should be the RB1 in a Joe Burrow offense come week 1 of the 2024 season. He's an instant RB2 at RB3 at absolute worst. So I do like, while I prefer Jaylen Warren with this pick, I'm going to roll the dice. I'm going to take a gamble because this goes back to what we were talking about, where you pay attention to the website that you're playing on. You pay attention to their ADP. And on Sleeper, Zach Moss usually goes ahead of Jaylen Warren. Zach Moss goes around pick 95. We're on pick 94. Jaylen Warren usually goes around pick 100. And if you'll see over here, I still have a pick before 100. I have a pick 99 coming up. So we're going to roll the dice, and even though we like Jaylen Warren more than we like Zach Moss, we're going to roll the dice, take Zach Moss, and just cross our fingers that Jaylen Warren comes back, and if not, we know that we're going to be okay. Boom, this worked out perfectly. After I took Zach Moss, it went Deontay Johnson, Brian Thomas, Austin Eckler, who I do like this year, by the way, and Jackson Smith-Njigba. So 3 wide receivers, none of which were Christian Watson. No idea what these computers are doing. But Jaylen Warren, still on the board. Again, pass-catching specialist in an Arthur Smith offense that wants to use their running backs as much as possible. Tons of upside if anything happens to Najee Harris. This is a terrific 9th round pick, especially since we did end up going hero RB with Derrick Henry as our RB1, but no clear RB2. Now, really quickly, a lot of the guys on our team are going to be in our lineup most weeks without even having to think about it. We're going to start Kyler Murray. We're going to start Derrick Henry, Tyreek Hill, Cooper Kupp, Christian Kirk, Dalton Kincaid. Those guys are going to be in. We don't have to think twice about that. But at the RB2 position, there's going to be a lot of weeks where we ask ourselves, do we want to go with Zach Moss, Jaylen Warren, some of the other running backs we're about to draft? Who do we go with? And again, This is where, on those tricky start-sit decisions, those tricky dilemmas where we can't quite decide which player to go with, and it's not clear, again, this is where Basement Brewed Fantasy Football subscribers are using the weekly heat map. You're looking at week 13, but we do this every week. Week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4. And the way that it works is you simply find the players that you're considering. So you would click Jaylen Warren, look at, you can read what to expect from that player in the upcoming week. It's going to tell you which direction, what to expect from that game, right? It's going to tell you, is this going to be a high-scoring game, a low-scoring game? Are the Steelers expected to win by a lot, so they're going to run the ball? Are they expected to lose by a lot, so they're going to pass the ball? And Jaylen Warren has a chance to rack up catches. It's going to tell you what to expect from the game itself. And then we dig into the micro level, the individual level, where we're talking about which direction that player is trending. How has Jaylen Warren been performing over the last couple weeks? Is he gaining touches? Is he losing touches? Is he on the verge of taking over as the RB1 in Pittsburgh? It's going to tell you what to expect from that defense. How is the defense trending? How does that defense perform against similar style running backs? So you get everything that you need to know about Jaylen Warren and what to expect from him in that upcoming week. And then you search Zach Moss, and you do the exact same thing. What do we expect from Zach Moss? What do we expect from that game? Which direction is Moss trending? Is he starting to gain touches, lose touches, etc.? This is a resource that Basement Brewed Fantasy Football subscribers are using every week to conquer those really, really critical lineup decisions and figure out who they want to put in their flex or in their RB2 position. So we are going to go ahead and grab Jaylen Warren. And in the 10th round, I would love to see Gus Edwards there. This is working out so beautifully that it's making me nervous that I'm just going to get sniped like crazy in my real drafts. Like, this mock draft is working out so beautifully. The fact that I'm staring at Gus Edwards, I'm not even going to look. I don't even, well, I will for the sake of this episode, but I don't need to look at the draft guide. If you listen to episode 1 of Inside the 20 by Basement Brewed Fantasy Football, thank you, by the way, for listening. I talked at great length about how insanely valuable the RB1 in a Greg Roman, Jim Harbaugh offense is. And as of right now, that man is Gus Edwards. Now, there's definitely a case for J.K. Dobbins and their rookie, Kamani Vidal. And I don't think I talked about Dobbins yet, but I definitely talked about Vidal in my Rookies to Watch episode and in that blog. But as of right now, the number one running back in Jim Harbaugh's system, in Greg Roman's system, is Gus Edwards. Greg Roman, who is the offensive coordinator for the LA Chargers, has been an offensive coordinator in the NFL for 10 seasons, and he has never, ever finished lower than 9th in the NFL in rushing attempts. His offenses have finished first, second, third, 7th, and 9th in the NFL in rushing attempts. Say what you want about Gus Edwards as a talent, as a player, but if he's the RB1 in week 1, the guy is going to get the football. And we have a chance to grab him in the 10th round and just slide him in to the RB2 role on our team underneath, funny enough, Derrick Henry with the Baltimore Ravens. Fantasy football is a game of volume. It's why guys like Kyron Williams went off last year. He popped in and started getting 20-plus touches a game. Zach Moss went off when he had the chance substituting for Jonathan Taylor last year, getting 20-plus touches per game. Gus Edwards is far from this world-changing talent, but we know he's going to get the football, and now we have a chance to slot him in, not even every week, but most weeks, as our RB2. And if we don't like him that week, we can go with Zach Moss. And if we don't like him that week, we can go with Jaylen Warren. This is a big reason where in 2024 specifically, most of my drafts end up going wide receiver heavy to start with. Sometimes I'm getting that stud tight end in the first, 4 or 5 rounds. Sometimes I'm getting a quarterback, and then I'm just backfilling it with quality RB2, RB3 flex type of options who have bigger upside if things just break right for them in 2024. So we're going to go ahead. I'll pull up the draft guide, But yeah, in this tier, Gus Edwards is the lone remaining running back. These wide receivers aren't like none of them jump out at me as guys we need to have between Khalil Shakir, Tyler Lockett, Josh Palmer, Rashid Shaheed. I'm more than happy to not just more than happy, I'm thrilled to get Gus Edwards at the end of the 10th round here. All right, so after I took Gus Edwards, the Gus bus is rolling in round 10. After that, we saw Adonai Mitchell, Cole Kmet, Romeo Doubs, and Chase Brown. So here we are in the 11th round. This is pick 123 overall, and we're coming up on the end, right? This is only a 15-round draft. Now, because we have a strong quarterback, because we have a strong tight end, we're literally ignoring those positions for the rest of the way. We can expect Kyler Murray is going to be our quarterback. We can expect Dalton Kincaid is going to be our tight end. There's no reason for us to waste bench space on a second tight end or a second quarterback. And similarly, I'm likely going to draft one, maybe two more wide receivers in this draft, but we know Tyreek Hill is going to be starting every week as long as he's healthy. We know we're going to have Cooper Kupp in there every week. We spent a pretty premium pick on Christian Kirk, 4th round. We know he's going to be in there most weeks. And Terry McLaurin was a steal at flex. Now, we might flex Terry McLaurin in and out depending on the matchup, but for the most part, we know Tyreek's going to be wide receiver 1, Cooper's going to be wide receiver 2, Christian Kirk's going to be wide receiver 3. There's not a terrible need to keep stocking up on wide receivers because those spots are filled. You need to, in fantasy football, you need to trust yourself. And when I talk about roster construction, that means trusting, adjusting your fantasy football draft strategy according to the draft capital that you spent on other positions. I spent my 1st round pick on a wide receiver. I better expect that person to be in the wide receiver role every single week. I spent my 2nd round pick on Derrick Henry. I'm going to expect him to be in the lineup every single week. Okay, so the point is there's not a lot of need to add a ton of depth here at wide receiver, whereas RB2, we're going to be shuffling and trying to figure, we're going to be playing matchups using Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's heat map. We're going to be playing matchups every single week to determine the best possible RB2 to go alongside Derrick Henry. And in this case, none of these wide receivers speak to me in a way that says I need to draft one of them, and I'm going to take the best running back available in the next tier, which is Ezekiel Elliott. Now, say what you will about Zeke being washed up, being old, being a shell of himself, not being the same Zeke that we used to know and love, but in the 11th round, we're getting the RB1 in a Dallas Cowboys offense that led the league in scoring in 2024. It's hard to find that type of value at running back in the 11th round. It's a pretty easy pick here with Ezekiel Elliott. All right, we are back on the clock in the late 12th round. This is pick 142. The best available players, the best available tier is a group of wide receivers, and I have no problem grabbing my 5th here. Mike Williams is at the top of this list. He is definitely falling in 2024 fantasy football drafts due to reports of, not being quite healthy enough, potentially kind of starting the year a little bit slow. But man, you're taking a guy like Mike Williams, who's penciled in as the New York Jets wide receiver 2 in an Aaron Rodgers offense. There's just so much more upside to Mike Williams than his current cost, and that's somebody that I'm more than happy to stash on the bench, especially if I already have Tyreek Hill, Cooper Kupp, Christian Kirk, Terry McLaurin, tons and tons and tons of upside to Mike Williams as a fantasy football asset in 2024. More than happy to go ahead and scoop him up at that cost. All right, this is going to be our last pick of a skill position player before I force myself to do a defense and a kicker, and I'll actually talk about strategy for that in just a minute after this pick. But as far as roster construction goes to this point, we have our 1 quarterback. We're not even looking at quarterbacks. We have our 1 tight end. We're not even looking at tight ends. We have 5 wide receivers. We have 5 running backs. We know we're very strong at wide receiver, right? We used 4 of our first 6 picks on wide receiver. And we know that we're going to need to get creative at RB2. And we have plenty of great options already, right? If we're going Derrick Henry RB1 every week, and then we just have to choose between Zach Moss, Jalen Warren, Gus Edwards, Ezekiel Elliott, the Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's heat map is going to help make those decisions. But because we know that the RB2 position is the current vulnerable spot, we're going to go ahead and grab another running back here. Okay, so we are going to basically skip this best remaining tier of all wide receivers, and now we're getting into a pretty big tier of running backs. We're talking Marshawn Lloyd, Rico Dowdle. Rico Dowdle I'm not going to draft because I already have Ezekiel Elliott, and I am not a handcuffer, by the way. Handcuffing is a great way to cap your own potential upside. We got Jaleel McLaughlin, we got Ray Davis, Kaimani Vidal, who I won't take because I already have Gus Edwards, Ty Chandler. Now, if you listen to any of my rookie episodes or any of my NFL draft episodes, I love Ray Davis. I think he's a great sneaky pick in the 13th round, 14th round of fantasy football draft picks, but it's really hard to ignore this one. Jaleel McLaughlin, who is flying up draft boards right now amid reports that the guy ahead of him, Javonte Williams, is allegedly battling for a roster spot, which is wild. And on the off chance that Javonte Williams gets cut or gets traded, suddenly Jaleel McLaughlin is potentially that team's RB1, or at least in a position where he's going to get plenty of volume. That's a lot of upside to be able to bet on in the 13th round. I don't even see him in this. Oh, here he is, Jaleel McLaughlin. We're going to grab him. That's a great potential volume play for us to lean on as our RB2 if we need one. All right, let's wrap this beast of an episode. I am exhausted, by the way. Hopefully you're not as exhausted as I am. Hopefully this has been helpful. But let's wrap this episode with rounds 14 and 15, our last two picks, with a little bit of strategy here. Now, if this was me in a regular draft, in a real draft, I wouldn't even be drafting a kicker or a defense here unless my league forced me to. I wouldn't even be drafting one. Instead, I would be using those last two spots on another running back and or another wide receiver. I want to use those bench spots. Sometimes I like to use those last two spots on guys that will not play in week one, so I can stash them on injured reserve and then just pick up my kicker or defense later. Of course, keep your own league settings in mind. Maybe you guys are forced to take a kicker, you're forced to take a defense. Maybe you're in a league where it costs you money or some other penalty to you, like you get a certain amount of waiver moves. Keep all that stuff in mind. But if all that stuff doesn't cost you anything extra and you're not forced to take a kicker or defense here, not only am I not drafting to the last rounds, I'm not drafting any period at all. One of the biggest mistakes I see fantasy football players make is that they think, oh, I got to get the Baltimore Ravens defense. I got to get the 49ers defense. That's great, but teams like the Baltimore Ravens play against teams like the Kansas City Chiefs, and you're forcing yourselves to put that type of defense in against an elite offense. That's not something I'm particularly interested in. Now, Basement Brewed Fantasy Football, myself, my subscribers, again, this is where we like to use the lineup setting heat map. Every week there is a streamers tab where you can come in and see recommendations for which defenses and which kickers you want to use in any given week. So in this week, in this example, week 13 of last year, we were recommending picking up and using the Jacksonville Jaguars as our number one defensive option against the Cincinnati Bengals, which sounds weird, but Joe Burrow must not have been playing that week, and the Bengals were expected to score less than 15 points according to Vegas sportsbooks. That's a great offense to target with your defense in fantasy football. So instead of coming over here and grabbing an elite top tier defense, we prefer to play matchups. And here's a perfect example for you. I sorted sleepers projected points for defenses, basically a top to bottom list of who they expect to be the best fantasy football defenses in 2024. So a lot of fantasy football players might come in and say, ooh, the Jets are at the top, I need to get the Jets. That's great, but the Jets play against the 49ers in week one. That's not really an offense that I want my fantasy football defense to be to go against in week one. The Dallas Cowboys go against the Browns. That's okay. It's still not ideal. The 49ers, we just talked about it. They go against the Jets. I don't want my defense going up against Aaron Rodgers. The Ravens play Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs. The Chiefs play Lamar Jackson and the Ravens. I don't want to use either of those defenses against either of those offenses. So you get the idea and you keep going. Eventually you get to a team like, the Seattle Seahawks, who open up the season against the Denver Broncos, who are either going to be starting Zach Wilson or Bo Nix or Jarrett Stidham as their week 1 quarterback, that is most likely going to be a lower scoring game, a game where the Broncos shouldn't score a lot of points, the quarterback could make some mistakes. That is an opportunity where I can already tell you the Seahawks are probably going to be my number 1 streamer defense recommendation in the week 1 heat map of 2024. So in this example, again, I wouldn't even bother using a pick on a defense or a kicker. I would stack up another wide receiver, a running back like Ray Davis, who I mentioned before, and then right before week 1 begins, then I would make some adjustments with my roster, drop a player that I don't expect to be a big part of drop a player that I have to drop, and this is where I would pick up the Seattle Seahawks, for example. Last but not least, we will scoop up the kicker. Again, I usually wouldn't even use this pick on a kicker or a defense. I would just grab another bench player, but you get the point. Now, the way that I approach kicker during the season, I certainly don't draft one and then use him all year. That never works. I stream kicker, and a lot of times, another area where this pays off is, let's say week 1 goes, and we'll just use this top one. Jason Sanders is my kicker for week 1, and then everything happens in week 1. Puka Nacua happens. Kyron Williams happens. And suddenly those guys become instant hot waiver wire adds, the top priority for waiver wire. My kicker is my first one to go. If I'm going to place a waiver claim, I would rather place a waiver claim where I drop my kicker, drop my Jason Sanders, than drop Jaleel McLaughlin or one of those running backs that I want to stash at the end of my bench. Hold on to that player as long as I can, right? So the way that I approach kickers during the season is, using the heat map. We're going to offer a streamers tab. And what I like to do is, target kickers that are in high-scoring offenses. That's obvious. High-scoring offenses score points. When you score points, you have to kick the ball, etc. But specifically, I like to target kickers who have an implied total, according to Vegas sportsbooks, that is a weird number and doesn't imply only extra points. So in this example, Brandon Aubrey of the Dallas Cowboys in week 13 of last year, he had an implied point total. His Dallas Cowboys had an implied point total of 28. That would be 4 touchdowns and 4 extra points. That's only 4 points for your kicker. Meanwhile, Jason Sanders this week had an implied point total of 29.5. So whether it's 29 or 30, that implies some field goals combined with some extra points. It's a good way to try and project or try and predict how many times the kicker is going to come out on the field and kick through field goals and not just extra points. And when they're on the field, maybe it's a 30-yarder, a 40-yarder, a 50-yarder. I love targeting these kickers that are in the 25-point range. Matt Amendola, Riley Patterson, Jake Moody. That implies these guys are going to kick. What does it take to get to 25? 3 field goals and a couple touchdowns. I'll take that out of my kicker any week. So every week we're putting this together, making it easy for Basement Brewed Fantasy Football subscribers to identify which kickers they want to just snag right off the waiver wire, plug them into their lineup, and more often than not, get it right. So in this case, I haven't done week 1 yet. The week 1 heat map will be coming out in several weeks. We're not quite to that part of the season yet. So let's just grab a random one from last year. It says Jason Sanders at the top. I don't even know if he's available. There he is. Boom. So there we have it. We'll let this thing wrap up. Final results. We have Kyler Murray as our every week quarterback. Quick note on that. Like I mentioned, if you're comfortable with it, I personally might skip on quarterback and just stream. I might grab a Brock Purdy, a Tua Tagovailoa, Aaron Rodgers, who is way underdrafted this year. We got Derrick Henry as our RB1. We're going to use the heat map every single week to decide our RB2 between Zach Moss, Jalen Warren, Gus Edwards, Ezekiel Elliott, and Jaleel McLaughlin. Wide receivers are relatively locked in. We got Tyreek Hill, Cooper Kupp, Christian Kirk. We got Terry McLaurin, who's a pretty strong flex play. And even weeks where we don't use Terry McLaurin, we got Mike Williams, who's going to be a wide receiver 2 in an Aaron Rodgers offense. We have Gus Edwards, who's going to be playing, who's going to be the RB1 for Greg Roman. Ezekiel Elliott, who's going to be the RB1 on a team that finished first in scoring and 5th in offensive yards last year. Lots and lots of options here. Tight end, we got a top 5 option in Dalton Kincaid. And then at kicker and defense, we're just going to stream our way to 10 and 20 point weeks every single week. Hopefully you found this episode helpful. candidly, it's exhausting. I'm like genuinely tired. And I know this is a beast. I apologize, Tanner, my wonderful producer and editor who's editing this right now. I apologize for how long this is. But let me know in the comments or send me an email, send me a message on social media. Let me know which content you tend to prefer. Do you like the player-specific analysis better, or do you like the fantasy football drafts and the strategy portion of everything better? Let me know. I'm still trying to decide which way I want to go with the show over the next month before we really get into the crux of fantasy football season. That's all for today. Just a reminder that you can scoop up your very own 2024 Fantasy Football Draft Guide from Basement Brewed Fantasy Football. It costs less than a case of beer at $14.99. We left a link for you below in the show notes. And before you do that, I am currently running a promotion until August 1st that anybody who joins Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's Discord server, which is our online community, that's where I'm hanging out 24/7. That's where I'm dropping fantasy football insights as I find them. That's where I hang out all fantasy football season with 163 other fantasy football players. And anybody who joins that community gets anywhere between 25 and 50% off of Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's cheat sheets, like the draft guide, the heat map, the things that you saw in today's episode. So if you join the community, you can get those things for 25 to 50% off. The links for everything is in the show notes below. But again, that's all for today. I'm going to go take a nap, maybe grab a beer beforehand. I will see you on the fantasy football field, and I hope to see you in our Discord server. Cheers. This brew's for you.